Okay, today is the 17th of March, 2015. It's also known as St. Patrick's Day. And I'm about half Irish, and I have that little green shirt on there to remind the people that I did have a grandfather. Anyway, the topic is the foreign policy of Henry Kissinger from 1968 to 1976. And my guest is David DeWitt, leading reporter for the Athens News. And I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And this is the Athens Speakout number 323. So we want to review what we said last week. And last week we were focusing on Ed Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, two renegades, two radicals, who exposed the U.S. intelligence system. And they both denounced the Obama administration, and the Obama administration has said nothing about Glenn Greenwald because he has credentials, but they would like to put Snowden on trial for violating the Espionage Act. And Glenn Greenwald got his information from Snowden, from the grassroots, and spiked it up a bit by writing for the London Guardian and explaining how the United States government is allowing the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the DIA, to kind of run away with the story. And we also touched on the economic problem of why Obama's in trouble. He was elected in 2008 after some bubbles, some stock market crashes. Stock market crashed, the real estate banks crashed, the insurance companies crashed, and the recovery has been slow. It's been a little better than 2008, but you really can't say that the economy is perfectly healthy. The national debt keeps going up, the foreign trade keeps going up, and the sales for automobiles are good, cell phones good, oil business good, but the middle class wages are slow compared to the rising prices of everything else produced by the great corporations. So we have a kind of a stalemated economy. And the wars that were started by George W. Bush in Afghanistan and Iraq are inconclusive, and Obama has done nothing about those wars. He's cut the casualties back a bit, but he hasn't gotten to the root of the causes, even though he was elected twice as president, 2008, 2012. He hasn't really gotten to the root of America's long-term Middle East problem. And yes, he assassinated Osama bin Laden, but then there are 3 or 4 new terrorists that take his place. So there's no measure of any progress in the war against terrorism. The public's reaction is, well, okay, they assassinated Osama, but so what? There are new challenges from Syria, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan. The Taliban are still powerful in Pakistan and still powerful in among the Afghan tribes. And we have the new jihadists in Iraq and Syria. And there is no clear light at the end of the tunnel for peace. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, and Obama seem to be vacillating. First they talk about a ceasefire, then they begin to say we need to send more troops to fight terrorism in the Middle East. Anyway, Hillary Clinton is now running for president against 5 or 6 Republicans, and they're all speaking a lot of double talk on television, and none of them have a strategy for peace, except these renegades like Ed Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, and they are gradually gaining ground among some other left-wing journalists. The Vietnam War was a long, indecisive war from 1961 to 1975, and the wars of George Bush in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2003 are still not concluded. Now, that was a lot different than the 19th century. From 1776 to 1945, the United States won 6 decisive wars. Polk, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt had a clear strategy, and they had democratic public opinion behind them in their wars. Then there were 2 stalemates, the War of 1812 and the Korean War. And neither the public nor the Congress were really clear about what the purposes of either of those wars, and there was some debate while they were going on. The Civil War is unique. It was a bloodbath, a mistake, and I think it could have been avoided with better politics. So anyway, the slaves were condemned by the Jewish religion and the Christian religion, and the Southern property holders who defended slavery had a very superficial understanding of the real religions of Jesus and St. Paul and the 17 Jewish prophets who were usually on the side of peace. Franklin Roosevelt helped win World War II against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. And they had a very clear strategy of the problem of democracy versus fascism. And you might say that the 2 Democrats, Churchill and Roosevelt, saved Western democracy for France, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, West Germany, and restored democracy to West Germany and Italy. And they reestablished a United Nations international organization, which has done better than the Experimental League of Nations in the 1920s. Truman and Eisenhower had usual ordinary presidents. Truman and Eisenhower saved Korea, South Korea, as an independent state. And eventually, South Korea developed a democratic capitalist system over the long run. There was some gain against Japan. Japan didn't have a democracy before, but the United States has also established a fledgling democracy or experimental democracy in Japan, and Japan, like South Korea in the next 50 years, may become viable democracies. So World War II was not a total victory. Now, the evolution of democracy, what I'm saying is, in Britain and in the United States, began in the 17th century. And democracy is a very difficult system of government to be established. And there was about 100 years of peace in the 19th century that allowed democracy to grow in Britain, France, and in the French Republic. France had more difficulty than either Britain or the United States. The First Republic lasted for 20 years, the Second Republic for 2 years, the Third Republic lasted for 66 years, and the Fourth Republic was reestablished with American and British aid in 1946, and that lasted until 1958. And Charles de Gaulle, one of the victors of World War II, established the Fifth Republic. So France does have a viable democracy, more conservative than its previous constitutions. And Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon weakened democratic capitalism, weakened democracy and capitalism through their futile wars in Indochina, which were expanded on debt. So I think I'm ready now for the first question to our guest, Dave DeWitt. What did Henry Kissinger accomplish for U.S. foreign policy from 1968 to 1976?
What did he accomplish? That's a great question. I think it depends on what perspective you're looking at.
Okay.
For U.S. foreign policy, from a United States perspective, what did he accomplish? My point of view is that the first thing he accomplished in 1968 was to help Richard Nixon sabotage the Paris peace talks and convince southern Vietnam to walk away from the negotiating table, and therefore prolonging the Vietnam War for the election of Richard Nixon.
That's a negative.
That's a negative.
Right.
Yes. He probably wouldn't think of it that way.
Well, my response to that is that that was a short-term problem for Hubert Humphrey in his declining years in 1968. But Kissinger then had a number of years from 1968 to 76 to persuade Nixon to get out of Indochina, which Humphrey and McGovern and Fulbright and Mansfield and the Democratic Doves were advocating. But Kissinger was able to have it in a disguised retreat.
Yeah, to gradually pull the troops
That's right.
out.
Now
so
you can say
you
can say that from the point of view of the boys, it could have been done a little sooner.
Yeah.
But that's a debatable question.
I have a question for Mr. DeWitt. What was the one thing that you think Kissinger did to sabotage the Paris peace talks?
Well, from what we've learned from the Johnson tapes when they were released as to his understanding of what the Nixon campaign was doing, was that they basically told the South Vietnam negotiators that they would get a better deal under President Nixon than they were going to get under President Johnson. And so they told them to hold off and wait. And they did.
Okay.
So and they left Paris and they...
To wait for a better deal.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. That's the way Johnson understood it, at least. And
is that the way you interpreted it, Dr. Whaley?
Well, I think that that's a trial balloon that may or may not have worked, but it's guesswork. We don't know that if Humphrey Humphrey had won, whether Humphrey would have gone through, or whether Hanoi would have said no to Humphrey. See, you just assume that Hanoi is going to agree to Humphrey's proposal.
Or Johnson's.
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah.
Johnson made the proposal, but Johnson wasn't offering the North much. What was he offering the North to stop the war? Ho Chi Minh said, I want to unite Vietnam. And Johnson said, I want to keep Vietnam divided at the 17th parallel.
It would have
at no
divided.
point did either Johnson or Nixon admit, we're going to give up the 17th parallel. Now, Kissinger finally did it through stealth diplomacy and lying.
He was good at that.
Yeah, and he said in 1972, when Nixon was reelected, we're going to take our troops out, but we've given the Saigon government new equipment, new airplanes, and 44 provinces in South Vietnam will be held by Nguyen Cao Ky, Nguyen Van Tu, General Nguyen Van Tu and Nguyen Cao Ky. They have the wherewithal to hold the line against the North. Now, I think Kissinger was lying.
Yeah, I don't believe that he believed that.
But he got
But it
Nixon
was a
elected.
convenient way to
And
get.
he fooled the Republican Party to vote that Nixon is carrying on the war and he's going to bring victory. Now,
Yeah.
only after Nixon gets elected did we find that Kissinger goes to Paris and makes a deal with Lee Ducteau from the North.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're going to pull the plug. We're going to get out.
Right.
And then what could the Republicans say? Nixon's already in office.
Right. Yeah.
Nixon won the election.
Which was the point. Yeah.
And Nixon was already in trouble with Watergate. So Nixon couldn't protest.
Yeah.
So I think Nixon had to be,
And there was a great amount of war fatigue in general at the
Yeah.
time.
well, yeah, sure, no question. Okay, so that is one of the ifs of history, as they say.
Yeah.
If Humphrey had not been sabotaged, as you call it, would Humphrey have made a deal, and would the North have agreed to Humphrey's proposal? We don't know what Humphrey's proposal was exactly. He just says,
No.
we're going to start negotiations.
Well, yeah, they were carrying on negotiations.
Yeah, but
Johnson's
the negotiations were
administration was.
inconclusive in Humphrey's. He didn't come up with, hey, we're going to get out of South Vietnam.
Well, they hadn't. Yeah, the negotiations hadn't gotten to a point where they had come up with any sort of plan. But you can't come up with a plan when your political opponent
Okay,
is
all
making
I'm saying
your
is,
ally walk away from the negotiating
all I'm saying
table.
is that in the history of diplomacy, some negotiations are very short, like the Iceland agreement between Reagan and Gorbachev, 1986. We're going to have a new proposal, start. It was immediately signed, and it gave quick results. There were also quick results with Kennedy's test ban treaty in 1963, when Kennedy did it. But there was a long campaign between 1958 and 1963 on the part of the British and Khrushchev to get Kennedy to come to that test ban. Kennedy was the last one to agree to it.
Yeah. Well,
And
Kennedy, he was a true believer.
Well, he was an anti-communist, and he
Yeah,
only became.
that's what I mean by true believer.
He only came to the conclusion that they needed a nuclear atmosphere test ban treaty toward which turned out to be the end of his administration. So negotiations can depend upon how much preliminary work was done. And some people go in there and they just have unclear proposals. They get nowhere. That's the problem with negotiations. They may have worked, they may not have. That's one of the ifs of history. If you're a fan of Humphrey, you would say, yes, Humphrey would have made it. There's a lot of debate about Kennedy. Some say that if Kennedy wasn't assassinated, he would have made the deal and he would have gotten out of Vietnam in the next 2 years. That's another debate.
That's a debate. Yeah, that's debatable. I'm not sure that he was giving all the signs that he would have pulled
He
out
gave
of
some.
Vietnam. He was giving signs. I think he was giving more signs that he would have committed to Vietnam along the lines.
Okay.
that
Well, from
Johnson
my
did.
understanding is he said to his national security advisor, well, I'm going to go to Dallas, and as soon as I get reelected, see, that's the if, as soon
Yeah.
as I get reelected, I'm going to have some kind of a proposal because we can't win this war. Well, that'll never be proven. And the conspiracy theorists say, well, maybe that's the reason why he was assassinated. There was a rogue element in the CIA who said, Kennedy's going to make peace. Well, let's get rid of Kennedy, and then we can continue the war.
Yeah.
Well, that's another one of the ifs of history.
Yeah.
Who shot Lincoln? Well, they
Well,
say
there's a lot
John
of-
Wilkes Booth. Well, did John Wilkes Booth have Confederates? Well, that's also debatable.
The Booth.
Yeah, there's some debate about John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
It's not as debatable as
Not as
the
Lee Harvey.
No, it's not as debatable as that.
Yeah. That was because he was a very well-known actor. His brother was one of the most well-known actors. It's almost like
But he didn't have a trial to really get at Bush.
no, he didn't.
He kind of
But
escaped.
there was the whole trial of the Surratt, Mary Surratt.
Yeah, they
and
have
John
circumstantial.
Surratt in absentia and
Yeah, yeah.
David Harold and
right,
the
right.
rest.
Now,
Yeah.
there are some Booth fans who say, well, he escaped from that farm and went out to Missouri and was seen alive 20 years later.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a little story about that.
Never heard that one.
Well, you can read biographies of John Wilkes Booth. Is John Wilkes Booth really dead?
Yeah,
Well, it's speculative.
yeah.
And I'm not a fan of the Confederacy, so I've never read it.
I've never read
Anyway,
that one
we're
either.
kind of stalling on this.
So, Henry Kissinger-
What did he accomplish here?
Well, if you look at it from the traditional perspective, you could say he accomplished things rebalancing world power. You could say that he opened up China. You could say that he helped end the Vietnam War. But if you look at it from the critical perspective, you could say that he
Postponed. Yeah, I agree with that.
Submitted. He accomplished
He stalled.
political assassination throughout the
Wait a minute,
world.
who did he assassinate?
He overthrew a democrat. He helped
That's
overthrow
right.
a democratically
Pinochet
elected
in Chile. That's right.
government in
That's
Chile.
a negative. That's a negative.
They assassinated. Well, they say that in 2011, the Allende, Salvador Allende, the autopsy. They say that there were multiple bullets from different guns in his corpse, and therefore it wasn't a suicide. It was an assassination.
I think Pinochet was a product of Kissinger's plot.
Oh, absolutely. I think so too.
But,
Yeah.
but the defenders of Kissinger say, well, Chile was a side issue. The important thing is the Soviet Union and People's Republic. Those were the major issues. China
On
and
the
Russia.
global stage, that might be true, but I don't think that we should diminish the fact that a democratically elected government was
That's
overthrown.
true. A democratic government Kissinger was not a good Democrat.
No, he wasn't.
That's true.
And then there's also his meddling in Bangladesh and
Now, what happened in
Cyprus and
Bangladesh? I don't
East
understand that.
Timor. They were just various along the similar lines of
Bangladesh was
installing.
not a democracy, was it?
No,
Okay.
but it was installing people of power that Kissinger preferred over whatever.
Yeah, all right. The
regime
story of
might have been.
Bangladesh is that Kissinger had to make a secret trip to Beijing to start the negotiations with Mao. But he couldn't let the Soviet Union get wind of this, and he couldn't let the Republican diehard anti-communists hear about it.
Right.
So Kissinger says, I can only get to start negotiations. There comes negotiation. I can only start the negotiations if I get Pakistan to set up this secret airplane trip from Pakistan to Beijing so that I can talk to Mao and Chiang, and I mean Mao and Zhou Enlai.
Because it's got to all happen under.
You got to have a plan. If Nixon is going to come to China, you have to have a preparation of that.
Sure.
So he had to have Pakistani aid because Pakistan had good relations with Beijing. And the United States had this bamboo curtain. They weren't talking. So how do you get around the bamboo curtain?
Well, you got to have secret talks.
You got to have secret talks. So he intervened in Pakistan, and Bangladesh then had a little war in 65? 75? It was just before the, it was in,
So early 70s.
in the early 70s,
Yeah.
before Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing.
Right.
He had to go a year ahead in 71. He had to set that up. And he had to do it through the good offices of West Pakistan. Now, Bangladesh, the people in Bengal have a different language than the people in Lahore in West Pakistan. That was an inevitable breakup of a rather peculiar state. Two Muslim states on two sides of India, unified by religion, but they're not particularly compatible in language and history.
Yeah, or culture. Yeah.
Right, right. So Bangladesh then got its independence, and Kissinger did give a lot of aid to West Pakistan to repress Bangladesh. So the Bangladeshis don't like Kissinger. That's
I
true.
wouldn't think
Yeah,
so.
yeah. He was repressive of that.
Yeah.
He was not a Democrat. But
No.
that's the balance of power.
Well, he was definitely a power player,
was
but
a power player.
I would say that a lot of the ways that he played that chess game violated
Okay.
international law.
So let me give the positive side here. The problem was the American public opinion, ever since 1945, had built up this anti-communist ideological crusade. And anti-communism is not pro-democracy. And what Henry Kissinger did was to stop talking about communism and start talking about nation states. And the anti-communist ideologue said that Beijing is a puppet of Moscow, and all communists are evil. Communism is communism, whether it's Tito, whether it's Cuba. That was the line of Richard Nixon and most diehard Republicans. Well, Kissinger and some diplomats in the State Department who were Democrats said, well, China as a nation state has differences with Soviet Union as a nation state, and we can split them. And that's what Kissinger did. He split them and created a true balance of power in which you have a scale, and the United States being in the middle can tilt toward Pakistan or toward Bangladesh or toward Israel or toward Egypt or toward... He could move the United States on one side of the scale to win the interests of the United States at the cost of other people, yes. Yeah, he exploits other people. So I give Kissinger credit for restoring balance of power thinking to American foreign policy, because the alternative to balance of power thinking is an ideological crusade which will inevitably lead to the next war. That's the problem in the Middle East. Netanyahu and the Israelis have an ideological crusade. It doesn't make any difference whether it's Iraq, Syria. There's always going to be an enemy. So you got to keep the arms race going. So the anti-communist crusade gave the military-industrial complex plenty of money to sell arms, because there's always going to be another war. What Kissinger said is, we can cut the costs of Vietnam and allow Beijing and Moscow to compete with one another on a diplomatic balance of power scale.
Well, he essentially drove a
argument.
wedge.
What's that?
He drove a wedge between Beijing
Yeah, you have to
and
drive a
Moscow.
wedge. That's what it's all about.
Which is, yeah, and considering a historical person like
Right.
Kissinger, he knows the
Right.
value of that
Right,
and the balance of power that existed in the 19th century.
right,
for
right,
instance.
right.
That's true.
So that's the overall accomplishment that I think, and he did get the United States out of that quagmire in Vietnam. Because
Eventually.
it took time.
Took another 5 years after 68.
That's true. Now, you have great faith that it could have been done shorter by Humphrey, could have been shorter by George McGovern, but the people didn't vote for George McGovern. George McGovern was defeated because there were too many Democratic hawks who wanted to sell weapons. There were too many hawks who want to give aid to Israel forever.
Yeah. And the selection of Eagleton didn't help him any.
Well, that was an accidental
Yeah.
fault, but basically, war sells quicker than peace. To get a peace treaty is very difficult.
Oh, to actually obtain one, yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Robert, let's
Yeah.
take a station break.
Yeah, we got to stop. We got through the. Yes, we're debating the diplomacy of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and I give Kissinger an overall high rating for getting the United States out of Indochina and creating a balance of power between the People's Republic of China and Moscow, which in the long run avoided World War III. And we're debating this with David DeWitt, a younger journalist who is more of an idealistic Democrat, I would say, and less of a balance of power realist, because I get this balance of power realist from long experience of European wars in which you have to have 5 or 6 powers on the scale competing with one another peacefully, and that preserves the peace and avoids an all-out war. And World War I and World War II were a collapse of the traditional balance of power system for ideological reasons. And so I think that ideology has been overrated in the United States between 1945 and even to the present day. We still haven't gotten over that idea that the United States can do it alone. We are number one, and we will win the next war just because we are number one. No, you can't be number one forever. That's my theory of how Johnson and Nixon failed, by being too ideological and not flexible enough. So Kissinger then, in one sentence, taught Nixon and Jerry Ford how the new balance of power system would work. Now, in the 19th century, we had 5 or 6 powers competing with one another who more or less kept the peace in the 19th century. There were very few wars. And the objective of Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Adolf Hitler was to destroy a balance of power and try and conquer the whole world. And that's the important thing, is how many Americans believed that World War III was inevitable. That was what Kissinger, the good Kissinger, was. He said, you're going to have to negotiate with both Beijing and Moscow on limiting nuclear weapons.
Robert,
Yeah.
don't you have some papers there indicating the balance of power?
Well, yes,
I wanna show that
you
to
want to get right to the point here. Let's look at this graph here. Let's define the balance of power as it was understood in the 19th century. This then is the typical conflict between France and Germany, which lasted over a century. And Great Britain stood in the middle at the fulcrum. And Great Britain then could tilt this balance of power by sometimes going on the side of Germany, sometimes on the side of France, for the interest of Great Britain. So the successful operator in the balance of power is to get yourself on the middle and have the competing powers out on the edge competing with one another. And that system was more or less what it looked like during the 19th century. And France then was defeated at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. No, the other way around. Germany had the weight, and France, everybody was tilted against France in 1815. Because there were 2 German powers, and Britain was temporarily on this side. So you had Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia having the balance of power in favor of that coalition, and France then was isolated. That's how the balance of power works. And then sometimes Germany no longer could have its allies, and Germany was isolated, and then France was able to tip the balance of power in favor of France by finding new allies. And that was what happened in the end of the century. The French were able to collaborate with the Russians and bring the Russians in. Then in 1904, they got the British in, and pretty soon it was the Triple Entente against the powerful Germany. And that's how the World War I ended, with France being the predominant power, and Germany was isolated. Germany had no allies in 1919.
Oh,
it was
yeah,
finished.
and then the treaty.
And the treaty
decimated.
that just so that's how the
Any
balance
power
of power
that they had.
operated during that whole century, and but for the most part, it kept the peace, with the exception of the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, were two failures of the balance of power. The balance of power is designed to keep the peace, but when it breaks down very seriously. That's the problem with it. It doesn't always work because of ideological and economic forces beyond them. So anyway, I understood the balance of power before Kissinger did, because I learned my history from Hans J. Morgenthau at the University of Chicago, and A.J.P. Taylor at Harvard, and William L. Langer. No, A.J.P. Taylor, Oxford. I went directly, had some courses at Oxford. But William L. Langer of Harvard was the leading diplomatic historian from 1935 to his death in the 1970s, and explained World War I with several books, and explaining how the breakdown of the balance of power led to World War I. Mm-hmm. He was one of the great, and A.J.P. Taylor explained how the traditional balance of power broke down, leading to World War I. They both had slightly different interpretations of how World War I broke out.
So do you think that if I agree that opening up China and driving a wedge between Moscow and Beijing created more of a power balance,
Right.
that might have avoided another world war.
Right.
Do you think that could have only happened under
Oh, I don't say that
the way that Kissinger did it?
I'm not saying that Kissinger was inevitable. Nobody's inevitable.
Okay.
But it was Kissinger who...
Do you disagree with the tactics that he used? I mean, what he did in Cambodia. I see. My thing about Kissinger is I understand how adept he was at manipulating power balances around the globe and all that, but I have a strong moral objection, regardless.
You are a true Christian.
To his.
Fine.
Well, I'm not a Christian, but
You're not a Christian. Where do you
I'm
get
not.
your morality from?
I get my
What makes
I get my morality from the long traditions of Greek philosophy and literature and human nature, and the fact
All right,
that I love my brothers and
Greek,
sisters.
Greek philosophy was passed down to Jesus and Paul, and they synthesized Jewish philosophy and Greek philosophy. And what's called Western civilization is a synthesis between Greek and Jewish ideas, and then of course that was synthesized by the Romans. The Romans passed it on to the French passed it on to England, and the United States then inherited a Christian religion which was influenced by both the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's where our morality comes from. The Ten Commandments are universal between Christians and Jews. So whether you got it indirectly or through your mother or your father, somehow or other, or your teachers, you became somewhat of a... Now, you can interpret Christianity in many ways. There are liberal Christians, conservative Christians, but the world didn't begin and end with Socrates. It was started by Socrates.
Oh, I know
then
all that
Socrates
history, and
put-
but I wouldn't discount all of Eastern religion. I mean, that doesn't take into account Confucianism
All right,
or
what's the-
Buddhism. But we're
we have a
getting off
question
track
here.
here.
I'm just saying, you're getting off the subject.
All right,
Yeah.
we're talking about Kissinger. We were talking about the balance of power.
But so what I was saying is that I have
Yeah,
a moral objection to the death and destruction that he caused, his anti-democratic
Well,
ideals.
is that worse than the number of deaths that Johnson and Nixon caused? caused in Vietnam?
Well, Kissinger was responsible for many of those deaths. What about Cambodia? He was responsible for devastating that country illegally.
Okay, we agree that Kissinger and Johnson were both responsible for mass deaths in Indochina.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that under Kissinger, the deaths in Chile and the deaths in, what was the other incident?
Well, you could say Chile, you could say what he did to Bangladesh, East Timor, Cyprus.
All right, now.
All these places. He
did they-
exploited these
all right,
populations.
Okay, add that up with Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. Were they any worse? Didn't Eisenhower intervene in Iran and cause death? Didn't Eisenhower get into Guatemala?
Well, Kissinger did in Iran too. He encouraged the
Okay.
Kurds to fight Saddam Hussein before
Okay.
he made an alliance
Okay,
with
so
Saddam Hussein,
what
who then in turn
is the
massacred
great
the Kurds.
moral? We're just talking about morality.
Yeah.
How is Kissinger more immoral than Atchison, Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Kennedy? How did the Korean War break out and how did it end? What does that got to do with
I
morality?
don't know if I would make the argument that he's more immoral, but I do think that you could make a case prosecutorially that he violated international law and human rights in ways that those others.
How many presidents have
He didn't have a- he didn't have a declaration of war to
What did
overthrow.
Polk do in Mexico? Did he violate
Oh
Mexico's?
yeah, absolutely. He did.
Okay, so this idea of morality is so complicated. We'll have to drop that subject.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, do you think it's possible to be a world leader without
I
violating
am
human
saying
rights?
I am saying that every politician lies to his public.
Yeah. I
Now,
agree
some
with that.
people have caused lies which cause numbers of death, and others are less. Sometimes there are white lies. I think the lies told to Beijing and Moscow didn't cost the Americans many lives, and it probably saved a lot of Vietnamese lives. Just looking at that problem of Indochina and China and Russia. We didn't go to
So
war.
it's a matter of scale then? How many lives are going to be cost inevitably? It's a matter of how not to let too many.
There's a question,
be lost?
Kissinger explains it quite clearly, that statesmen, whether they're presidents or whether they're secretaries, fight for national interest.
So
It was
they're
not
only
to the
concerned about
national
the US.
interest of the United States to keep that Vietnam War going because there was no coherent strategy.
Yeah.
Now, there was a national interest in defeating fascism under Roosevelt. There was a national interest in coming to the aid of Britain and France to prevent Germany from overrunning two democracies. So
World War I.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think that Wilson and Roosevelt and Lincoln and Washington were our greatest presidents. They cost lives, but the sacrifice of the soldiers who lost their lives in World War II had some positive effect at the end. The veterans who came back from Vietnam, the veterans who come back from
Yeah.
Laos, Cambodia, they don't know what they were there, and Indochina. I mean, the Near East is worse. Look at all this mental defects we have of why they were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. What did that accomplish?
Natural resources. We got.
So it's
that's
not
in
a
the
question of
national interest.
lives. It is what is the payoff of a victory in war?
Yeah.
The United States had several successful wars, but Vietnam was a disaster. And it had many causes. It wasn't just Kissinger and Johnson, but
Sure.
and it was also that military-industrial complex who just wanted to sell weapons.
I think
They
that's a
were
big part of it.
Yeah, okay. So we have to bring in the capitalists when we talk about war.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The DuPont Chemical Company made money in the
That's
First
I
World
think
War.
that's a
Dow
huge
made
part of
company
it.
in
That's a good point. Regardless, if you're a member of the State Department or an intelligence agency, you're taking orders from somebody. And I guarantee you, Henry Kissinger took orders from somebody. He didn't act on his own.
Well, he had to take orders from Nixon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying, when you take a position like that, you are going to be told what to do and
Right.
probably how to do it.
Yeah.
Now, if you know how to do it better than the person giving the orders, you might suggest something, but otherwise, you'll do what they say if you want to remain in that.
Now let's talk about the Cambodia. The idea of invading Cambodia was Nixon's idea.
Yeah.
And Kissinger said, "Don't invade Cambodia. You're not going to get rid of the Ho Chi Minh." But
Yeah.
Kissinger had to back off. So, okay.
So we can put that one on old Nixon.
Nixon went into Cambodia, and you could say all of the lives lost in Cambodia were due to Richard Nixon and not Henry Kissinger. But anyway, Kissinger then backed off, but the Cambodian thing didn't have any positive effect on shortening the war in Indochina.
Yeah.
It was just a sacrifice for nothing.
Sure.
Okay.
I guess what I find disturbing about it, though, is, I mean, I understand it's in the national, what they thought in the national interest, but I think if you go around the world violating other countries' sovereignty, you're violating international law agreements that the United States has signed to, and I think we should hold them to account for that. I can't just let it slip. I can't let it pass. I can't let the human rights violations pass.
Kissinger's fine, but how many cases have there been in international law in which the culprit was brought to the bar of justice? Very few.
And those are the ones that we set up for
Who
sacrifice.
enforces international law?
Or,
Who enforces international law?
Well, theoretically, the United Nations.
Okay,
And
what? There have been a few
World Court.
test cases. There was a case of Iceland versus England over who controls the fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not a basic problem. International law
No, that's
did
not a
not
human
prevent
rights
World
problem.
War I. It did not prevent World War II. Okay, Hitler.
It didn't even prevent the Iraq War.
Okay, so international law is a wonderful standard, and I think that the Declaration on Human Rights
The work of Eleanor Roosevelt.
is better than nothing. But we have to have law that's enforceable.
Yeah.
And domestic law is
Well, but it
enforceable,
speaks
and
to our
international
great
law.
ideals of
Interna-
Western culture, the
You
Magna
need-
Carta and
yeah,
habeas
yeah,
corpus
yeah, okay, fine.
and rights of
Okay,
people.
yeah, I agree with that
process.
morality.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I don't know why you're against Christians, because,
I'm not against Christians. I'm just not a Christian.
well, we'll debate that.
And
yeah.
I don't think that we're a Christian nation. I think that we have a lot of Christian influence in our nation, but I think one of the proudest things that we have in America is to be the only developed country in the world to have enshrined in our Constitution in the very First Amendment the
That's
complete
fine.
and utter separation of church and
That's
state.
fine. United
Free
States-
both of and from
That's
religion.
right. But and the First Amendment says that Congress cannot establish a religion. And it's true, the United States does not have an established Christian church.
Or
That's-
prohibit the free exercise thereof.
That's all, okay.
So freedom both of and from
Right,
religion.
right.
Guaranteed to us.
Right.
The only nation in the world.
The only nation?
Yeah. With that hard line standard right in our Constitution.
Oh, I think the French have that.
They have it's a different standard. They're actually a little bit more zealous about pursuing their secularism than the United States is.
All right. Well,
Because they'll do things
you
like
want to
ban
get off on
burkas
another
and
subject.
what-
Let's keep
Yeah.
going on Kissinger. Okay. And this morality thing can go on forever,
Yeah.
because that's 5 or 6 civilizations over 5 or 6 centuries. It can't be done
Oh yeah, no.
in this amount of time.
Yeah, we would,
So let's talk about Kissinger's
Go on for
balance of power here. How Kissinger changed the system in 19 1973 at the end of the Vietnam War. The balance of power in 1973 had the Soviet Union clearly the heavier weight, and the People's Republic of China was the weakest. So what Kissinger does is, being in the center, throws his weight on the side of Beijing to tilt the balance of power in a more even way, and the Soviet Union then lost ground up to 1993, and they collapsed altogether. And the Russia in 1991 disappeared because the Soviet Union collapsed. So it wasn't simply Kissinger's diplomacy, but it was also an internal problem of Stalinism. The United States did not win the Cold War. What happened was that the Soviet Union imploded.
Yeah.
Because Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, there was a lot of national dissent, which weakened the old Soviet communist ideology. And it was Nixon who said, stop talking
Especially
about it.
the Stalinist version of it, which is very
right,
tyrannical, authoritarian.
Right. So that's how the balance of power was tilted by Kissinger's clever diplomacy and encouraging dissent within the Soviet Union, and you had to have arms control. Kissinger had arms control with the Soviet Union, the ABM Treaty in May of 1973, and he had arms control with Beijing because he said, we apologize. The United States should never have kept Beijing out of the UN, and we're giving concessions. We're not only going to get out of Vietnam, we're promising Beijing you can have the seat in the UN. So
And they got the veto power.
This opening of China that you talk about is
Security Council.
part of the peacemaking. It just wasn't opening the door. It gave positive influence to future negotiations.
Yeah. And at that time, probably only a Republican administration could have done or accomplished that.
Right. Okay. So I guess that's about all I want to say on that. Well, I think we can expand now on the third question I have here, a little more detail on the nuclear arms agreements. I just quickly mentioned
Yeah.
the ABM Treaty and the need to have the United States and the Soviet Union gradually have more disarmament of nuclear bombs because we reached overkill.
Because up until that point, it was a
Right.
race. It was
Right.
an arms
Right.
race.
So I don't think any president wanted a nuclear war, but there were rather uninformed, ignorant people in Congress who kept talking about nuclear war. This is the winning weapon. This is an umbrella. We need nuclear bombs.
Scary. Yeah.
So Nixon and Kissinger together gradually had disarmament negotiations with. Now China voluntarily kept its weapons to 300 because they knew that they could never catch up to the overkill of the Soviet Union and the United States. So if China's going to win, they're going to win through economics, population.
You're right. And their manufacturing capacity.
They're not going to use the nuclear bomb. And they figured out as
300 nuclear weapons is
Yeah.
nothing to shake a stick at.
No,
still.
but-
doesn't
but-
compare to the thousands that
but
the U.S. and USSR.
China and France did not sign the Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty. And their argument was kind of simplistic. Well, we need more testing to catch up with the three great powers, Britain and Soviet Union and so forth and so
Yeah.
on. Well, they just ignored that. And then as time went on and they kept working on the Soviet Union, China said, well, what is the use of these weapons anyway? So we now have 9 nuclear powers, but what are they going to do with the bomb? The bomb is not a rational weapon. It's a suicide device.
Yeah.
Now the United States...
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, United States discovered
agent
that
of terror.
they discovered that the hard way. When Truman was caught in Korea, he said, let's end the Korean War, let's drop the bomb. But then they said, well, what's the target? if you bomb Pyongyang, the radioactivity is going to blow back in your face.
Right.
It's a little bit stupid.
Yeah.
Well, how about going right to Beijing? Well, now you're going to have the Soviet Union retaliate? No, you can't go to Beijing. Yeah. So they couldn't find a target. And that was the problem of both Johnson and Nixon in Indochina. What's the target?
2-minute warning. Wow. Yeah. That's
So-
kind of scary.
Okay, well, I think we can kind of make a quick summary here, a conclusion. Do you have a conclusion about Nixon as a bad Democrat but good diplomatist?
I agree that he was successful in rewriting the balance of world power, Henry Kissinger. I also think that he massively violated human rights and international law, and he should have been brought to trial for that.
Well, that's true, but I don't know of any other Secretary of State or President of any country who's ever brought to trial in international law. International law is largely unenforceable. The League of Nations failed after 20 years. The United Nations has done some fringe things on the side, like UNESCO. It's expanded education to the third world, but it hasn't really gotten at the heart of the conflict between the 5 great powers who have a veto power in the Security Council.
Including China and Russia.
It's an organization, it's an experiment, it's better than no United Nations, but it works largely as a corrupt institution like the Holy Roman Empire. It's a government, but a very ineffective government. So my conclusion then is that Ed Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, starting out exposing the CIA, the DIA, and the NSA, have opened up the debate among historians and politicians and journalists. And we're getting back to the problems in the Middle East, which Kissinger had to handle. And I guess next time we're going to have to talk about Kissinger's role in the Yom Kippur War, the 1973 war, because he did the same thing by putting Egypt and Israel on both sides. So I think we have a little more to say about Henry Kissinger as a diplomatist, and we're getting off the Soviet Union onto the Middle East.
Sounds good.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Professor.
This is the another discussion of debate is necessary to keep democracy going, and I agree with you. We have to keep democracy and morality, although our morality is a little bit undefined at this point, going.
Thank you, Professor.